Thanks for joining us here on 90s Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Now, you may have heard about the three unidentified objects that were shot down in recent days over North American airspace, leading to a fair bit of concern, maybe depending on what you saw or how you see it, hysteria in some corners, depending on exactly, again, how you see it. For a bit more on what exactly is going on over the skies, we are now joined by the director of the Center for National Security Initiatives at the University of Colorado, Iain Boyd. Iain, thank you so much for joining us here today on 90s Plus.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Iain, I guess before we get into anything else, the obvious question here is, what the heck is in the skies right now? What is going on? What do we know at this point?
Well, I think if we hadn't had the first big object in the sky over a week ago, we probably wouldn't be shooting things out of the sky now, and we probably wouldn't be talking about this today. So I think it all started with that first object. And, China has admitted that it is theirs. They say it's a weather balloon. The US, we're saying it's some kind of surveillance vehicle. I think it was unusual because it was very, very large, much larger than a weather balloon ever needs to be. So that story was always in doubt. And of course, it was shot down and, being retrieved from the ocean and starting to be looked at by the intelligence services.
Obviously, this is speculative, but in terms of based on the size of the weather balloon and what you were just saying a second ago, do we have any idea what kind of surveillance would be being done at that altitude with that object?
Well, some of the early reports are saying that it was trying to track electronic signals. A weather balloon is measuring temperature and pressure in the air around the balloon. So it would not have sophisticated equipment for, picking up cell phone calls, other forms of electronic communication. And so, I think it'll be interesting to see how much more information that the government shares with us all, the general public. But those first indications strongly suggest, of course, that it was not a weather balloon. Tracking electronic signals, well, that's kind of interesting, but for spying purposes, that's not going to give you a whole lot of information.
Okay, well, I guess we can take a little solace in that, I suppose. Now, in terms, you mentioned how these most recent objects are something else. My understanding is that NORAD, North American, by the way, based out here out of Colorado Springs, is now kind of intensifying its radar coverage as well as its surveillance. You alluded to this earlier on. Is that the reason why we're seeing some more of these unknown objects at this point?
Well, I think so. I mean, there's many elements to this story. That first object was flying quite high, like at 65,000 feet. So that's above where we all fly in airplanes, which tends to be below 40,000 feet. And then these later three objects, they were all flying lower. So they were flying, in the lanes where we all fly. So I think it's a combination of two things. That first object that was found, I think, alerted the US and Canada, NORAD, and probably other countries as well, to look in that region of the sky more carefully than they usually do. And then also the fact that some of these objects were then being found at altitudes where airplanes fly meant, probably increased the pressure to do something about it.
Absolutely. Well, very interesting on that part. I guess the question that I know a lot of people are asking, that I'll just walk straight into it. Is there any possibility that this is aliens or UFOs in terms of what we saw back over the weekend?
Well, I think that's highly unlikely. I mean, for many reasons, but not least of which, it would be a little bit of a coincidence that after a large Chinese balloon, whether it's weather or surveillance, sailed over the US, that a whole bunch of aliens from some other world decided to pile in the days afterwards. So I think we'll find that the equipment that's retrieved from the debris is very much terrestrial in its origin, and certainly the intelligence services will be able to figure out very, very accurately and in detail what each of those objects was doing.
Based on what you know about this, is this the first time in recent memory that we've had some sort of hysteria? Again, hysteria maybe being a harsh word, but certainly a lot more media attention than usual about this sort of activity.
Well, there has been over the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, a heightened presence in the media about UFOs again. And the Pentagon in the US, has changed their approach whereby pilots, Air Force, Navy, and so on, if they see something unusual in their flights, they're encouraged now to report it. I mean, there's a process for doing that, whereas in the past, there wasn't a process, and I think the pilots felt, that they weren't being encouraged to do that. So there is a different approach within the military. There's some new activities in the US involving the Federal Aviation Administration and NASA also to do a better job of following through when commercial pilots report something unusual. So yeah, I think there's a heightened awareness, and I think that's partly coming from the fact that more people are flying. So regular aircraft that we fly across the country in, there's more of those. There's more smaller airplanes. Now there's drones coming into the airspace. So it's all becoming busier, right? There's more and more traffic, and that makes it more and more important for us to be able to understand every single object that's in that airspace where we're all flying.
So I guess maybe to summarize all of this here, Iain, obviously there's been a lot of attention, again, hysteria, however you want to call it. Do you think that perhaps all this is overblown at this point, or do you think that there is the right amount of attention being drawn to what's going on?
Well, I think from the threat of a national security, I don't think any of these objects probably represented a significant threat. I think it is a concern about objects getting into our airspace or any country's airspace, without permission. That has all kinds of implications for safe aviation. And then I think on sort of the international level, if this is all China, and some of this is provocative and maybe irresponsible, it's another example of a kind of step that China's been taking for many years in the South China Seas, in blowing up their own satellite and so on. That's destabilizing. So, we're all sitting here thinking, well, if this is China, what are they up to, right? What's their game plan here? And that's really destabilizing in a time of any high tension between the international community and China, like over Taiwan or something, right? If there's something going on in Taiwan and China, makes a step and we just don't know how to interpret it, that's very dangerous. Even in the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union kind of had an understanding of how each other would react under certain circumstances. I think in some ways, that's maybe the biggest element of this story.
Well, okay, can we go down that rabbit hole for a quick second here then? So what do you think, now that the Chinese are aware of the enormous, I would imagine they're aware of the enormous media attention the spy balloon, perceived spy balloon got, do you think part of their point now is to destabilize and to kind of evoke this sort of reaction from the American public, or was this unintended?
I think they probably underestimated the strength of the American response as well as the international interest and response to this situation. I mentioned when China blew up one of their own satellites. I mean, that caused tremendous concern for the international space operating community. The space station had to be moved out of the way of the debris, many times. And at the time, it was sort of thought China had underestimated, or miscalculated the results of their actions. Maybe this is another example of that. I'm just looking forward to finding out more information as the government shares it with us.
Absolutely. And maybe based on the fact that Anthony Blinken canceled his trip to go to China in light of everything that was going on, you said it, that the Chinese probably were maybe caught a little bit off guard in terms of the reaction a second ago. Maybe this will turn out to be a positive, and perhaps, again, I'm speculating here. We all are to a certain degree, but perhaps this does lend to them stopping some of this activity, perhaps?
Well, maybe. I think certainly the U.S. priority should be to try and deter China from taking any actions like this again in the future, because it's very disruptive in lots of different ways. And yeah, exactly. Very often positive things can come out of these unusual events. They're kind of a turning point, right, in how things work. And hopefully this will be a turning point for the better.
Any final thoughts on what we saw and the reaction and what we may learn here the coming weeks?
Well, I think I'm very interested to see, what happens in the next week, right? If there's another object this afternoon, does it get shot down? I think that the government will be learning more from all of this debris, and that will help them, help to inform how they try to address the next object of this kind. That's what I'm kind of waiting to see.
So we'll find out in the coming days. But in the meantime, Iain Boyd, we really appreciate a few minutes of your time here on 90s Plus and lending us some of your expertise on this particular subject.
Thanks for having me.